How do you get a shot from this, which is quite flat and boring, to this, which has some depth, some story, some interest in the frame? What is missing from this frame compared to this frame? It's missing two things. It's missing depth and it's missing shape. And these things can be sorted out by using practical lights, by using composition, by using mise-en-scène, which is anything that's present in the frame, just to add some interest, and by shaping the light overall a bit more. And all these things come together to, like I said, add depth and to add shape, which overall creates a more interesting and more cinematic frame. The lighting I'm going to use is a Godox SL60 watt, which is quite accessible, especially for beginner filmmakers, an Aperture MC, which is kind of on the pricey side, but you can go to like your local hardware store and replace it with a warm bulb. The main effect that I was going for here was just a warmer light, and the original bulb that came with this lamp had a colder look, so I just used the Aperture MC because that's what I had. But you can go to any store and get like a warmer bulb. It's quite cheap. I also used an original bulb on another lamp, which is quite cold, and that's like 30 rand, which in, I don't know, USD is probably like $1.50. I don't know, it's quite cheap. I also used barn doors, a honeycomb filter, and a color filter as well. Okay, so the first thing you want to do is you want to turn off the house lights, which I know seems quite dumb to mention, but you'd be surprised how many people in the beginning forget that the lights are on in the room. So the first thing is turn the lights off in the room so you have control over your frame. And immediately, as you can see now, we have a much more dramatic, a much more cinematic shot. And that's not only because we have more contrast between light and dark, it's because we are shooting shadow side. We have immediately some more shaped lighting. The lighting isn't bouncing all over the place. It's more onto the character, but that's kind of boring unless you're going for maybe like a horror scene where you want something to be able to come out of the shadows. This is kind of boring. The background is basically non-existent. The foreground is also basically non-existent. It's mainly just the midground, which basically makes a 2D like flat plane. It's not very interesting. The first thing I did was adding a practical lamp in the background. I just replaced the bulb, like I mentioned before, with an Aperture MC, which I could turn into something warmer, like 2700 Kelvin, which is kind of just to add some separation between the character and the background, which immediately adds some insinuation of depth of life in the background. The next thing I thought was, this lamp is lighting up nothing. It is adding interest to the background, but not really. It's lighting up the fact that there's absolutely nothing in the corner. So what I did was I added some books to add interest in the background, and so the light has something nice, something textured to bounce off of. Then I thought also there's nothing on the right side of the frame. It's kind of dead. So I added another lamp, and with this lamp I left the cheap bulb in there. It's a colder bulb, which would also add color contrast compared to the Aperture MC, which is warmer. As you can see, the shot is quite tight and the lamp wouldn't really show in the background. So what I did was I pulled the shot backwards and I added more of the room so I could also pack more context and more objects in the frame without cluttering too much of the one corner, because if the frame is tight, it's easy for you to overpack the scene or the shot with too many objects, which will kind of make the viewer confused on where to look. One thing I did to add more depth in the shot after that was to physically move the subject away from the background as well, because the further away you are from the background, the more blur you'll have, which will obviously separate the subject from the background more. Another thing you can do to add depth to the frame is lower the aperture on your camera, and the lower the number, the higher the amount of blur, or the more blur that you have in your background. So for me, the lowest my lenses could go is aperture 2.8. When it comes to composition, I positioned the character more in the center frame, and then I added the two lamps as well in a position that frames the character. So it's a bit more guidance for the viewer, and it's also cool to have like the character framed. And then obviously I wanted to add some texture for the light to bounce off of, so I added a pile of journals, some gear like this lens, and that kind of added texture and interest to the background as well, and to the right side of the frame, which was quite boring. I didn't like how boring the outside was. I wanted to add an insinuation that further out there's more things happening, so I added moonlight using the Godox SL60. As you can see here, I set it up. I used barn doors to control where the light is, and to further control where the light is, I used a honeycomb grid, which condenses the light instead of it spreading wildly everywhere, which I didn't want. And then I used a cheap color filter, which was way too blue, but I didn't really have an option for accurate moonlighting, so I just added that with the intention of lessening the color or the intensity in post-production. As you may or may not know, the moonlight is actually a mixture of blue and green. It's not just blue, but I intended, like I said, to change the colors in post. And as you can see immediately, this is a huge improvement. It adds interest to the frame, it adds more life to the frame. And now the one thing that's missing is the foreground, the area in front of the subject. There's nothing there, it's non-existent. We do have some leading lines from the table. As you can see, we kind of had that in the beginning of the shot already. Leading lines are basically lines in the frame that subconsciously lead the viewer to where you want them to look. And as you can see, the table kind of leads to the laptop and the character. The foreground is still non-existent, so I want to add something in the foreground to show, oh, there's a foreground, there's a midground, and the background. So what I did was I took some books, I put that in the corner. It's very subtle, but I didn't want to overthrow, like I said, the midground. Then I used another book, particularly with a reflective surface, or I think it was glass. And the reason I did that is because when I place it down, as you can see, it reflects the lamp from the background, which kind of adds cause and effect from the background to the foreground, which makes the frame even more dynamic and more believable and more three-dimensional basically. And it also, reflections are always cool. That's why you see in films where they literally spray the roads so that we have some reflections. It also adds more texture in the frame. And then what I even did was I moved my USB Mac thingy, the silver thing, so it kind of leads from the reflection of the book to that thing, I don't know what's it called, to the laptop, and that adds a bit more of a leading line because we're kind of blocking the table with all this foreground. But as you can see now, we have a foreground, midground, and a background, and it's overall a more dynamic frame. A few more things I did change after I looked at the frame a bit more was the lamp's positioning looked a bit too curated, a bit too placed, and as you know, film is more about faking a realistic or natural look. It mustn't look placed there by a filmmaker. So what I did was I added some more books behind the lamp on top of the wire. I also shifted the whole section of the lamp on the right a bit more towards the edge of the frame because I liked how it looked. And then I also shifted the frame around a bit physically with the camera, and also shifted the foreground a bit. And finally, now you can see we have little pockets of light adding depth throughout the frame, guiding the viewer's eye. We're adding shape, we're adding depth, and it's more pleasant to the eye as well to look at. Thank you all for watching and taking the time to watch the video. I hope you got something from this, and yeah, bye.